I'm standing on my balcony right now, watching the evening light play across the Turia River in Valencia. The air is cool, a gentle breeze coming off the water, and for the first time in what feels like forever, the ground beneath my feet feels completely solid. There's a quiet peace here, a sense of having built something real, carefully, honestly. No shortcuts, no lies. It's a feeling I chased for years, and it only truly settled in after I stopped performing for anyone, after I decided to just be here. And to get here? Well, that story starts with a wedding that imploded, thousands of miles away, on a day that was supposed to be absolutely perfect. The truth is, I stopped loving Eleanor the second she screamed at me about napkins. Not because of the napkins themselves, but because of what I saw in her eyes. It was this chilling, absolute certainty that I deserved to be humiliated, that my very existence was just something she had to constantly manage and correct. 6 months later, I was signing divorce papers in an Austin lawyer's office, 2 attorneys on each side of a polished table. She was reapplying her lipstick between pages, like she was getting ready for a photoshoot instead of ending a 15-year marriage. 14 months after that, I was sitting in a small cafe in El Carmen, here in Valencia, watching the light change over the river. My phone buzzed, a message from Daniel Miller, an old college buddy back in Austin who, naturally, saw everything on Instagram. The message was short, but it hit me like a physical punch. Eleanor's getting married in 3 weeks. Willamette Valley, someplace called Evergreen Vineyards. I stared at that text for a long time. The timeline just didn't make sense. Until it did. And then all those little pieces clicked into place, the sudden business trips, the late meetings, the new, expensive clothes she started buying about 8 months before I filed for divorce. But the weirdest thing? I didn't feel angry. Not at all. I felt something far more useful, far more potent. I felt curious. To understand any of this, we need to go back a bit. Eleanor and I met in New York City, 15 years ago, at one of those charity galas neither of us really wanted to be at. She was in luxury real estate, I was in private equity. On paper, we were perfect. And for the first 3 years, maybe we actually were. Or at least, we were functional. Then, my job took us to Austin. We bought this beautiful house in Westlake Hills, which she immediately started renovating, and that's when the pattern truly began to emerge. Nothing I did was ever quite right. The furniture I picked was trying too hard. The restaurants I chose were obvious. My spontaneous weekend trip ideas were treated like I'd suggested setting money on fire. Now, I'm not saying I was an angel. I worked long hours. I got distant. I stopped trying to win arguments I knew were unwinnable. But somewhere around year 8, I realized I was sleeping in my office 2 nights a week just to avoid the feeling of walking into my own home. We had 2 kids, Maya and Liam, and they split right down the middle in a way that just broke my heart. Maya was 13 when I left, and she'd already figured out her mother's game. She'd watch Eleanor critique everything from my shirt choices to how I loaded the dishwasher, and give me this tiny, almost imperceptible eye roll. It was her small gesture of solidarity, and it made me want to protect her from the cynicism she was learning far too young. Then there was Liam, who was 11 and completely on Team Eleanor. He parroted everything she said about me being cold, uncaring, and embarrassment. I couldn't blame him. When you're 11 and your mom is magnetic and absolutely certain about everything, you believe her. Eleanor had this way of rewriting history in real time. She'd tell people I forgot our anniversary when I'd actually planned a dinner she'd then cancelled. She'd casually mention my anger issues at parties, even though I had never once in our entire marriage raised my voice to her. The actual truth didn't matter. The story mattered. Have you ever lived with someone who controls the narrative so completely that you start to doubt your own memories? It's a chilling thing. That napkin incident happened at a dinner party she'd insisted on hosting, despite me telling her I'd worked a 16-hour day and desperately needed sleep. She'd hired caterers, rented specific glassware, created a seating chart like it was a state dinner. I was exhausted, but I was trying to help. So, I set out the napkins, those expensive linen ones she'd bought from some boutique in Aspen. Apparently, I folded them wrong. She walked into the dining room, saw them, and her face, it did this thing it always did, right before she decided to make an example of me. Her voice cut through every conversation in the room. All 20 people stopped talking. She performed her exasperation and disbelief like she was on stage, turning to her friend Sarah with this look that just screamed, "Can you believe what I have to deal with?" I just stood there, holding a napkin, and something inside me simply switched off. Not in an angry way, but in a completely final way. I looked at her and thought, I don't love you anymore, just like that. Clean. Permanent. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just walked upstairs, took off my jacket, and started planning my exit. It took 6 months of quiet, deliberate preparation. I worked with a lawyer Eleanor didn't know, a brilliant guy named David Green who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and understood that sometimes, the best revenge is simply cold, hard legal strategy. We moved money carefully, restructured assets, created trusts for the kids that she couldn't touch. The house, the cars, the furniture. I let her keep all of it. Sounds generous, right? Except David had refinanced everything into her name 6 weeks before I filed, tied to balloon payments she didn't understand and credit lines she'd maxed without realizing. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I was trying to escape without her destroying me first. The day I told her I wanted a divorce, she laughed. Actually laughed. Told me I wouldn't survive without her, like it was a fact. Like I was some incomplete person who needed her to function. I didn't argue with that either. I just handed her the papers. The divorce was fast because I didn't fight her on anything visible. She got the house. I got my freedom. She told everyone I'd abandoned my family. I moved to Valencia on an AD7 visa, found an apartment, and I didn't correct the narrative. Maya texted me every day. Liam stopped speaking to me entirely. I saw a cardiologist here in Valencia who told me my blood pressure had dropped 30 points since leaving Austin. He said I'd probably added 10 years to my life just by walking away. Eleanor moved on faster than I expected. Within 4 months of the divorce being finalized, she was posting photos with Julian Hayes, some commercial developer who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a Brooks Brothers catalog. They were everywhere together, charity events, ski trips, restaurants with wine lists longer than most books. She looked happy in a way that felt aggressive, like she was proving something to an audience I was no longer part of. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere, the speed, the performance, the way Julian's smile never quite reached his eyes. But Eleanor had always preferred a good story to an inconvenient truth. Then Daniel's message landed in my phone, and I found myself thinking about Evergreen Vineyards. I'd been there once years ago for a corporate retreat. The venue was famous for its architecture, specifically this acoustic design feature where sound carried in weird ways. Conversations on one side of the terrace could be heard perfectly on the other, if you knew where to stand. I remembered the event coordinator mentioning it, half joking about how couples should be careful what they whispered during ceremonies. I sat in that Valencia cafe, watching people live their small, real lives, and I thought about Eleanor and the Willamette Valley, performing happiness for 300 witnesses. I wasn't going to the wedding. That would have been pathetic. But I wanted it to be memorable. I wanted one person to stand up and say one true thing, just to see what would happen when the story she'd built met reality. So, I made a phone call. To Arthur Thompson, an old client who owed me a favor and knew how to move through wealthy circles without raising suspicion. I asked him to get himself added to the guest list. Eleanor's wedding planner was someone who valued connections over verification. Then, I asked Arthur to prepare a toast. Not cruel. Not obvious. Just honest enough to let the cracks show. Then, I sat back and waited. Because the thing about Eleanor was, she'd built her entire life on a foundation that couldn't handle questions. And I was about to introduce questions she couldn't answer. Arthur called me 3 days after I sent him the details. His voice carried that careful tone people use when they're about to tell you something's harder than expected. He'd gotten on the guest list by mentioning a Copper Ridge development deal. Apparently, Julian had been name-dropping that project for months. Arthur figured he could position himself to give a toast by approaching the wedding coordinator during cocktail hour, offering to say a few words as a family friend from the Austin development community. Weddings that size always had people volunteering speeches, and coordinators rarely said no to someone who sounded legitimate. He asked if I was sure about this. Told me that once he said what I wanted him to say, there'd be no walking it back. I told him I wasn't asking him to lie. Just to ask questions. And he said that was exactly what made it dangerous. Maya reached out 2 days later, through Instagram, which was how we communicated now because Eleanor monitored her regular messages. She sent me a photo from Eleanor's feed, Julian and Eleanor at some wine tasting in Sonoma, his hand on her waist, her smile so bright it looked like it hurt. Then Maya sent 3 words that made my stomach drop: he's a con. She told me she'd been doing research on Julian because something about him felt off. The way he talked about money, the way he never gave straight answers about his projects. She found legal forum posts from investors in Las Vegas asking about Julian's development company, mentions of delayed payments and permits that never came through, a pattern that looked like a shell game. She said a lawsuit was coming, maybe more than one, that she thought he'd been moving money around to stay ahead of it. When I asked how she knew all this, she told me she called one of the Las Vegas investors, pretending to be a journalism student doing a project on real estate development. 14 years old and already better at investigation than most adults. I felt proud and terrified, all at the same time. Then she told me the part that made everything worse. Liam had moved in with Eleanor and Julian full-time, convinced that I'd abandoned the family and that Julian was a real father figure. She said Liam worshipped Julian, talked about him like he was some kind of hero. But Maya had been watching Julian at dinner, and he didn't even look at Liam when he talked. He just performed for Eleanor, while Liam sat there like a prop in someone else's show. She told me she was coming to the wedding. Not to celebrate. To document. She booked a flight using money she'd saved, told Eleanor she was staying with a friend that weekend. Planned to record everything, just in case. I told her to be careful, that I didn't want her in the middle of whatever was about to happen. And she said it was too late, that this was her family, too. Liam called me 4 days before the wedding, and I barely recognized his voice. 12 years old, but trying to sound grown, cold in a way that sounded exactly like Eleanor. He said his mom told him to call and let me know he wasn't interested in a relationship anymore, that I'd left and chosen myself over family, that Julian said a man doesn't run from responsibility. I let him finish, didn't interrupt. Then I asked him one question about Julian's last business partner and what happened there. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then he asked what I was talking about. I told him I wasn't going to poison his mind with accusations, but I wanted him to do something for me at the wedding. Watch what people don't say. Watch who asks Julian about his work, and how he answers. Watch his mom's face when someone congratulates her on the timeline. He told me I was pathetic, trying to ruin their happiness because I couldn't handle my own failure. Then he hung up. I sat there in my apartment, looking at the river, thinking about all the ways you can lose a child without them dying. The rehearsal dinner happened on Friday night, and Maya sent me updates like she was filing reports from a war zone. Eleanor was shaking, trying to hide it, but her hands kept moving. Julian told a story about acquiring a property in Palm Springs, and 3 people at the table pulled out their phones right there. Liam gave a toast about new beginnings, about how Julian showed him what strength looks like. Didn't mention me once. Arthur showed up and introduced himself as a family friend from the Austin development scene, and everyone bought it, though Julian looked nervous for about 2 seconds before recovering. Maya said the guy was good at performing. I told her to be careful, and she reminded me she was already in the middle of this. It was her family too. The night before the wedding, Arthur sent me a voice memo. I listened to it on my terrace as the sun set, his voice steady and certain. He drafted the toast to sound like advice from an old friend. Stuff about foundations, about making sure the structure can hold the weight, transparency in partnerships. He'd mention me in passing, make it sound generous so no one would suspect, then pivot to questions. Not accusations. Just questions. Asterisk: how did Julian close 3 dealerships in 18 months when the market was down? Why did his credit lines get restructured right before the engagement? What happened to the investors in Copper Ridge now that the permits were delayed? Asterisk: he told me the thing about questions was, innocent people answer them easily, while guilty people get defensive. And Eleanor was going to hear those questions in front of everyone she was trying to impress and realize she didn't know the answers. I told him he could still back out, and he laughed. Said he'd sat through 100 weddings where everyone pretended everything was perfect while the foundation rotted underneath. That someone should tell the truth for once. Then he asked what I thought would happen after. I told him honestly, I didn't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe Eleanor would laugh it off and Julian would charm his way through, and life would go on. Or maybe the questions would sit there like termites, eating away at the fantasy until the whole thing collapsed. Either way, I told him, I wasn't there, and I wasn't part of it. I was just the guy who gave reality a microphone. Maya's last message came at 11 p.m. Willamette Valley time, 2 a.m. for me. Is tomorrow going to be chaos? I wrote back that tomorrow, the truth gets to speak as loud as the performance. That after that, people can decide what they want to believe. Then I added that she should stay safe, record everything, and remember she was the smartest person in that room. She sent back a heart emoji, and I sat there in the dark, wondering if I'd just protected my kids, or put them in the blast radius. The thing about truth is, it doesn't care about your intentions. It just detonates, and everyone nearby feels the shrapnel. The wedding was exactly what I expected. Perfect in that aggressive way Eleanor always demanded, where every detail screamed money and taste and, look at what I built. Maya sent me photos throughout the morning, evergreen vineyards, rows of vines going golden in the September light. White chairs arranged in perfect curves, flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars. Eleanor in her dress, this fitted ivory thing that looked like it came from a Paris runway. Julian in a custom suit, his smile wide and confident, like a man who'd never been questioned about anything in his life. The guests arrived in their Range Rovers and Teslas, women in pastel dresses, men in expensive casual wear that said, I'm rich enough to underdress. Everyone performed their roles perfectly, the emotional hugs, the champagne toasts during cocktail hour, the way people kept saying, finally, and so happy for you, like Eleanor had been waiting her whole life for this, instead of being divorced 8 months ago. The ceremony was short and generic, some officiant talking about partnership and trust and building a life together. Words that sounded meaningful until you remembered Julian was facing investor lawsuits and Eleanor had no idea. Liam stood next to Julian as a groomsman, chest out, trying to look like a man. It broke something in me to see him there, believing in this. Maya sat in the back row, her phone positioned carefully, recording everything like she promised. After the vows, everyone moved to the reception terrace. A massive stone patio that overlooked the valley. And that's when I remembered what the event coordinator had told me years ago about the acoustics. How sound traveled in strange patterns. How the architecture created these invisible channels where voices carried across distances they shouldn't. Eleanor and Julian did their first dance to some Ed Sheeran song, and people watched like it meant something. Like love was a performance you could purchase with the right venue and the right lighting. Dinner was served, some 5-course situation with wine pairings, and then the toast started. Eleanor's business partner went first, talking about her drive and her vision and her ability to create beauty, which was true if you ignored everything it cost. Julian's brother spoke next, some generic speech about family and loyalty that sounded like he'd copied it from a wedding website. Then Liam stood up, and Maya's camera focused on him, his face serious and rehearsed. I listened through Maya's live audio feed from 7,000 miles away. Heard my 12-year-old son describe Julian as someone who doesn't run when things get hard, who shows up, who builds instead of destroys. He never said my name, but everyone knew who he meant. Eleanor cried these delicate tears that didn't mess up her makeup, and Julian put his hand over his heart like he was genuinely moved. The audience applauded, and I watched my son sit down, believing he just honored something real. Then Arthur stood up. The energy shifted in this subtle way that most people probably didn't notice. He introduced himself as an old friend from the Austin development community, mentioned some projects that made him sound legitimate, and started his toast with all the right words about foundations and partnerships and building something that lasts. People nodded along, comfortable, expecting the usual wedding platitudes. He mentioned me in passing, said something about how I was probably somewhere thinking of my kids today and wishing them well, his voice warm and generous. And I heard Eleanor's breath catch on the audio feed. This tiny intake that said she hadn't expected grace. He talked about Julian stepping into not just a marriage, but a family, a legacy, a structure that needs solid ground. Then he shifted. So smoothly it felt like the same speech. Started talking about foundations and what happens when you build on sand instead of stone. He asked Julian how he'd managed to close those 3 dealership acquisitions in Las Vegas during the downturn. Said it was impressive timing, and the question hung there, friendly but pointed. Julian smiled and said something about market opportunity and strategic positioning. Words that didn't actually answer anything. Arthur nodded like he was satisfied, then asked about the Copper Ridge project and how the investors were handling the permit delays. Julian's smile tightened just a fraction, and he said they were working through normal regulatory processes. Nothing to worry about. Arthur kept going, each question wrapped in admiration, asking about credit restructuring and timeline coincidences, and why Julian's business partner from the Palm Springs deal wasn't at the wedding. The audience started shifting. Phones came out. People looked at each other with this slowly dawning realization that something was profoundly wrong. Eleanor's face went from confused to angry to panicked in about 30 seconds. And then she stood up, her chair scraping loud against the stone, her voice carrying across the terrace. The acoustics did their job, bouncing her words back from 3 different directions, so it sounded like she was yelling from everywhere at once. Demanding to know who Arthur even was, saying this was inappropriate. This was her wedding. Arthur stayed calm, glass raised, told her he was just someone asking questions that good partners should be able to answer. Then he sat down, and the silence was enormous. Eleanor walked off the terrace, heels clicking, and Julian followed her, his face red. Suddenly everyone was talking at once, phones out and typing, searching Julian's name, and finding exactly what Maya had found. Lawsuit filings, investor complaints, a Reddit thread from angry creditors. The wedding imploded in real time. Not with an explosion, but with this slow collapse where the foundation just gave out. Maya kept recording, caught Eleanor in the hallway where she thought no one could hear, the acoustics delivering every word to the terrace. She was telling Julian he'd said this was handled, that the lawsuit was frivolous. And then she stopped mid-sentence, realized what was happening, pulled out her phone, and called me. I answered. Her voice was shaking, accusing me of sending Arthur, of ruining this. I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't ruined anything. I'd just let reality into a room she'd been keeping it out of. I told her life fell apart because she'd built it on a lie. Not my lie, but hers. She hung up. Within 6 hours, the toast video was on TikTok, then Twitter, then everywhere. Eleanor's face as Arthur asked his questions became a meme about denial and performance. Her real estate agency started getting calls, clients nervous about association, her reputation crumbling like Julian's business. The lawsuit against Julian went public 2 weeks later, fraud charges, asset seizure, bankruptcy. Eleanor inherited his debts without meaning to, creditors coming after her because she'd co-signed loan documents before the wedding. Julian convinced her it was for their future together, and she trusted him the way she'd never trusted me. Liam called me 6 weeks after the wedding, and his voice was different. Smaller. Younger. Stripped of the performance. He apologized, said he didn't know, didn't want to know. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about therapy, about learning to set boundaries, about realizing his mother had taught him to value image over substance. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, that's enough. Eleanor lost the house, downsized to a condo in Pflugerville. Her Instagram went quiet. I didn't celebrate any of it. I just kept living in Valencia, walking to my favorite bookstore, having coffee at the same cafe every morning. That's where I met Sophia. She owned the bookstore, loved poetry, laughed at things that were actually funny instead of socially strategic. We started talking, then having dinner. Then she met Maya when she visited for Christmas, and they stayed up until 2 a.m. talking about books and photography and what it meant to build a real life. Liam got engaged last month to a woman named Isabella who teaches elementary school and doesn't care about status or performance. He asked if they could have the wedding here, in Valencia, something small and real, just family. The true victory wasn't the collapsed wedding, you know? It was finally building a life based on truth instead of performance. It was learning that sometimes, the best strategy is simply refusing to participate in someone else's lie and letting natural consequences do the rest. When you stop performing and start living honestly, even if it costs you everything, you've already won. Do you think there's ever a right time to expose a lie, or should some truths remain unspoken?